Thank you. That sound all right back in back? Okay. Very good. As you can see, we're going to be talking about agility and patterns today, and talking about some common roots, and especially some common cultural roots. We'll get into that. So, to begin with, this is where we're going to go in the next 45 minutes or so. As I mentioned before, agility and patterns have got this common history, and a long history that goes together, and it's worthwhile to explore that. And as we learn about that, we'll learn more about what are some of the underpinnings of Agile. We'll then understand how patterns we might be able to fit that into our mindset about agility. And maybe it'll help us become better at Agile. Maybe it'll help us become better at software development, whether or not we use Agile. Maybe it will help us become better at other things besides software development, because there's a whole lot more to life than just software development, as we all know. So that's a very, very brief map of where we're going to go. Now, to begin with, who here can name a pattern off the top of your head? Anybody? Not you, Dick. Okay, has anybody heard of a pattern called strategy, or template method, or composite, or singleton, heaven forbid? Okay. Those are the patterns that most people think of, or the names that most people think of when they hear patterns or software patterns. But what is a pattern? Well, we won't go into a lot of depth onto this, but a very simple definition is that you have some sort of problem and you have some sort of solution. Now, the problem lives in a context, and so that solution then applies to that particular pattern in a context. That's kind of step one, but it goes much, much deeper than that. As you'll see in a moment, we got much of our inspiration from patterns from an architect named Christopher Alexander. And his initial definition, which again is superficial in itself, was that a pattern is a three-part rule. And it consists of a problem and then a system of forces, and then some solution or some configuration that then balances those forces. Now, this discussion of forces is very important, because the forces describe the deep nature of the problem and how that can lead to a particular solution, or can point away from things which we might think are solutions. So this part of forces is an extremely important part of patterns. Now, another definition is that a pattern is an element of a pattern language. This might seem a little bit circular, because what is a pattern language? Well, it is a sequence of patterns, and a pattern is an element in a pattern language. Seems a little bit circular, doesn't it not? Well, the important thing here is that no pattern is an island by itself, but a pattern then is used in conjunction with other patterns. So it's important to understand the other patterns in a particular pattern language so that you can understand where one pattern takes you and where it might lead you to other patterns. Now, unfortunately, we don't have enough time to go into really any more depth than that, detail than that on what patterns are, but understand also that it's not just the 25 gang of 4 patterns. In fact, some of us are kind of skeptical that those are patterns at all. I have heard one person refer to them as programming hacks. But that, again, is another discussion. But important point right now is recognize that there are many more patterns than just those. Now, as we understand the history and the underpinnings of agility, it's important that we understand the underpinnings and the history of patterns themselves, or software patterns. This is a picture of an architect named Christopher Alexander. In about 1976, he published a book called A Pattern Language, in which he spelled out over 200 different patterns. I think it was 243 roughly, give or take. Different patterns having to do with towns, buildings, and construction. That's right on the cover of the book. And his philosophy was deeply rooted in a desire to make the world a better place, do what he called make buildings live. It was rooted in Zen philosophy, Zen Buddhism, and so that became an inspiration for many of the early people in software. They picked up Alexander's book and they said, you know, we have some things in software that fit this general idea of what a pattern is. Several of these people, again, as I mentioned, several people, and initially they were working independently, and then they gradually coalesced together and started talking about ideas and formed what was then called the Hillside Group. We are fortunate to have one of the inaugural members of the Hillside Group sitting in the back. He's the one I told not to say anything yet, Dick. So this is Dick Gabriel. We appreciate him for being here. There were various different topics that were explored in this area. Some of them were microarchitectures, and those gradually morphed into some things called design patterns, but there were also ideas about software architecture in general. You can find those written up in books such as Pattern-Oriented Software Architecture. There were patterns on development episodes. Those were written by Ward Cunningham. You may have heard of Ward. There were patterns about organizational structures, patterns about programming idioms, and many, many other things. The list got larger and larger. You'll see I will focus on some of those in this particular talk. Now, one outcome of the Hillside Group was, after having many meetings, it was decided to hold a conference on patterns. This conference originally, the first conference was held in 1994 in a place called Allerton Park in central Illinois in the United States. And this was important for several reasons. These are a couple of pictures from Allerton Park, where the first PLOP conference, that's Pattern Languages of Programming, was held. You'll notice on that we have this China foo dog up in the corner, that blue China dog. Allerton Park is it used to be an estate of a very wealthy person who, when he died, donated it to a university, and they use it as a conference center, among other things. And it has quite a number of formal gardens. As you can see down here, we have a formal garden with some statues. There are actually a whole row of those blue China dogs. And there are many, many other things. And so it is really rich in atmosphere. It's a truly unique place. And that helped form some of the culture in patterns. Now, the first PLOP conference really intentionally set the culture of the patterns movement. The location was one thing, but we also had what we called a pattern ethics session at that first session. There are actually 3 of us in this room who were at that first PLOP. Besides Dick and myself, he's sitting next to Joe Yoder. And we all remember this session where we sat around and we talked about what are the values of this community that we are building, because we were building a community. We talked about intellectual currency. That was an idea that came from Mary Shaw. She's an academic, has published a lot in software architecture. And she said that intellectual currency is something that becomes more valuable as you give it away as long as the person who receives it gives you full credit for the ideas. So it became a very giving culture. Brian Foote, another one of the people there, said, you know, we're not interested in coming up with brand new ideas, but finding ideas that work and helping spread them so that other people can get those ideas. And he expressed it this way as an aggressive disregard for originality. And that phrase has stuck with us. And that's an important thing about this. As we write patterns, we recognize that we are not always the originator of the ideas, that other people had these ideas before, and we give them credit. But at the same time, people give us credit when we write the patterns, when we take the effort and the time to write the patterns ourselves so that other people can use them. Now, these became some of the seeds, not all of the seeds, but some of the seeds that go into the Agile culture and the Agile values. Here's another place. You can see this particular, it used to be a monastery, and it is now a conference center in southern Germany called Kloster Ilse, and that is where we hold a European conference on patterns. If any of you get really interested, you might want to go to that. It's not that far away. Linda Rising, I think, was the first person to put these words together. She said that patterns are not about software, they are about people. So there's a strong focus in this culture on people and helping with that. There's a very supportive environment. I want to mention two things. As the Hillside group came together and discussed how to improve the work, Dick Gabriel, who has a Master of Fine Arts in poetry, expressed the idea that what they do in literary works is they have a writer's workshop. And he brought the idea of writers' workshops into the patterns community, into the software patterns community. Now, the thing that's really interesting about this is that we in the patterns community took that idea and we made it our own, and we changed it considerably from what it is in the literature community. And that's fine. We built our own culture around that. Another place that we built our supporting culture is around the idea of shepherding. When a person submits a pattern to one of these pattern conferences, before it is ever accepted, it gets one-on-one mentoring with an experienced pattern writer who works with the author and helps them improve the work. This is called shepherding. And that's how I got to know Ademar, because I was his shepherd. He wrote a pattern, and I don't even remember what it was about. He might, but I hope so. And so I was his shepherd. Now, it turns out that shepherding has become an important part of the patterns culture. Again, it goes back to this idea of supportive. And as I mentioned before, giving credit where credit is due. Another part of the culture is this idea that patterns themselves are never completely finished. We get them as we write them and get them as good as they can be at the moment, but then we might learn, we might go back and improve them and rewrite them. But we're not going to take the pattern and we're not going to hold on to it until it is perfect, because that would never happen. But also we want to get it out in other people's hands as soon as we can, and then they have to understand that it might change, it might get improved. Hold that thought. And then Alexander himself, as I mentioned before, had important values. Yeah, let me mention this quickly. I have to apologize in advance. I actually got rather short notice that I was going to give this talk, and what that means is I don't know how long it's going to take. So I'm pretty confident that we will be out of here before 8 or 9 tonight. But oh, we'll finish on time, but forgive me if I skip one or two things if I realize I'm going too slow. Patterns became a form of literature. Now, a lot of people have written patterns that became seeds of agility. And when I was preparing this, I thought of 2 or 3 of them, and then I thought deeper, and I was actually a little surprised at the list myself. At the first PLOP conference in 1994, Jim Copleen brought a large set of patterns about organizational structure. These are organizational patterns. He and I continued to work on those and published a book on those. Ward Cunningham brought a set of patterns that he called episodes. What is an episode? What comes to mind? Does it sound kind of like a sprint? Yes. Yes, it was the kind of the seed, if you will, of the idea of sprints. I brought some patterns having to do with teams and teams working together. Mike Beadle and other people, I think Jeff Sutherland contributed to that, wrote some patterns on Scrum themselves. That was the first exposition of software Scrum, actually. Don Olson and Carol Stimler wrote some patterns on how to interact with managers. Paul Taylor wrote some similar patterns. Alistair Coburn wrote some patterns. And other people were involved in the patterns community who didn't bring patterns about organizations themselves, such as Kent Beck, Martin Fowler, Robert Martin, and I'm sure I have missed some people. Now, you see the names on there. Here's some people who were original signers of the pattern or the Agile Manifesto, with one slight exception, which I'll mention. And you will see these are some of the pattern people. That is Mike Beadle. I will probably see him this week, and he will probably kill me for using that photo of him. He's here we have Ward Cunningham, Alistair Coburn, Jim Copleen. He's the exception. He was not an original signer of the Agile Manifesto because he had a meeting conflict and couldn't attend the manifesto meeting. So he's kind of an asterisk on that list. Martin Fowler, and of course, Kent Beck. So you can see there's a whole overlap. Now, timeline. Patterns started in we can say the first PLOP conference was 1994. The manifesto was signed in 2001, 2002, something like that. Yes, so you can see patterns came first. In other words, these folks carried some of those values, those patterns values, into the formation of the manifesto. Now, the manifesto itself is kind of interesting. If you look at it, it doesn't say anything about process in there. In fact, the word customer doesn't even show up in the manifesto. It's all about values. In fact, it's explicitly about values. And not only is it about values, it's about comparative values, which is a little weird, actually. But the whole thing is, we value A more than B. And a couple of them, A and B, do not necessarily compare exactly. It's a little bit like comparing apples and oranges, which makes the manifesto just a little bit weird. But at the same time, it's useful, and it's useful to consider it as a values document. Now, what are values? They're the things that are important to us. The things that we feel are really, really key, they're the most important things to us. Corporations often reward people based on their particular values. So let's look at some of these value comparisons, and we'll see some of those pattern roots in them. So we have individuals and interactions over processes and tools. So there's that comparison. Now, in the pattern culture, I mentioned this several times before, that the pattern culture is really, really strongly people-oriented. And it's a lot about communication among people and building relationships. It is certainly an important contributor to this idea of individuals and interaction among individuals. At the PLOP conferences, we play some games, and those games are there partly as ritual and partly to increase social interaction. Now, the writing of the patterns themselves is focused on, as it says there, people-oriented. In other words, we try to make the patterns easy to use, easy to read, pleasant to read. So we think a lot about who's going to read this and what are they going to learn, and are they going to appreciate what is written. It says working software over comprehensive documentation. A few Agile people forget the word comprehensive and they just say documentation, and therefore we don't have to write any documentation at all. That's not what it says. It says comprehensive documentation. Now, patterns are all about writing stuff, though. How does that fit? Because in patterns we are emphasizing clarity, we're emphasizing brevity. Make the patterns short. We're making them easy to use. Write down the stuff that is important for people to know. Don't write the stuff that is not. Now, I suspect that both of these came out of a common origin, and maybe some of you have had the experience of having picked up documentation which is voluminous, a lot of documentation, and worthless. Anybody ever had that happen? Okay. I've got to tell a quick story, my own personal experience with this. I once met with a team of chief architects in our company, and I was discussing how it is that the process that they use to develop software. And so they said something like this: well, we design the software, we write the software, then we write the design documentation. Wait a minute, we test the software, then we write the design documentation. I went, okay, let's see. So you don't write the design documentation until after you've written the code, right? Right. Okay. Okay, what happens to the documentation after that? Well, we put it in our documentation management system, our document management system. Okay, and then who reads it after that? Well, nobody. Okay, so why do you bother writing the documentation at all, the design documents? They said, well, we have to check off the box that says we wrote a design document. I'm not kidding. Okay, so there's probably this frustration, and both of them came from that. Customer collaboration over contract negotiation. Well, we may see a little bit of the patterns culture there, in that patterns themselves are somewhat informal in nature. Patterns are not designed to be like a recipe that you follow blindly and you have to do everything, but they're supposed to help you think. And so it's the same kind of philosophy as this customer collaboration over contract negotiation. That may be a bit of a stretch, but I think there's some common values there. And finally, responding to changeover following a plan. Note that I said that patterns are never finished, that we recognize that we have to change them and update them. So there's some common philosophy there as well. Now, has anybody here been in an organization and had a little trouble introducing Agile into your company? Has that ever happened to anybody? Okay, why? Has it occurred to you we just went through some interesting values, and as I mentioned before, the Agile Manifesto is all about values, and it never says customer in there at all. Actually, does it say customer? Okay, it says customer. Yeah, I'm wrong. It does say customer. It actually doesn't say delivering software. So you could be Agile without actually delivering any software. It does say working software, but that's different than delivered software. And so we have this culture, and the roots of agility are based in people and interaction. And what are the corporate values you have? Well, corporations kind of have to make money. And is there perhaps a little disconnect between the typical corporate values and the typical Agile values? So if we go back to the Alexandrian values, the values that Alexander has, we look at those, they tend to be utopian. If you look up the root of the word utopia, it means no place. So impossible to achieve. Alexander talked about the quality without a name. These are things that don't pay the bills if you're a large corporation, or don't directly pay the bills. And so what this can lead to is you get kind of this lip service. You pay lip service to agility. In other words, you say all the right words, but underneath things go a little differently. You don't have the underlying culture and values. And that kind of a model is unsustainable. Something has to happen. And so as you wrestle with this, consider the following. If you've got any organization, the deepest held things that an organization have are the values. Those are the things that are most important to you. You have personal values. You have family values. You have community values. If you are in a church, you have church values. If you are in a corporation, you have corporation values. So all of those things then affect the structure of the organization. Now the structure then affects the process. And the structure also affects the architecture or the thing that you're building as well. So all of these are elements of the culture. And so we have to recognize the cultures that we are in. And sometimes we have to recognize that we have to deal with the art of the possible. In other words, we do what we can. We recognize that corporations that don't make money have a little trouble staying in business for a long time, and that they have these values. The corporations have to recognize that there are other things that are important besides just making money, and those have to come together. And you have to have shared culture, shared values. One thing that's interesting is if you look at Scrum, Scrum attempts to actually bridge this gap. One of the most important aspects of Scrum is the idea of a value stream. And a value stream it has one foot firmly planted in the hope that the company will be financially successful. It has another foot firmly planted in we are trying to provide value for the consumers of this, or sometimes what we call users. Although users is not a great term because we apply it to people who use software and people who use drugs, and maybe there's a connection there. So the value stream and Scrum tries to bridge this. And of the methodologies, the Agile methodologies that I've seen, that I've worked with, I like Scrum the best because of things like this. Okay, so why do we care about patterns? Why did we care about where these came from? Well, The shared culture, remember, that's what binds us together. As you understand the culture and the values behind agility, that lessens the chance that you will apply agile processes in a superficial manner without understanding their deep roots. And it also helps you so that you can then fit those into the existing culture of the organization you are in, and recognize that you are dealing with a culture and not simply a process. Understand that the manifesto itself is a reflection of the values, and those values are actually deeper than the manifesto. And finally, as you look at patterns, recognize that patterns themselves, I mentioned the forces before, the patterns themselves give you more deep insight into problems and solving the problems. They dig into the why, and why things work and why they don't work. In fact, the patterns themselves, I would say, are more timeless. They're going to last longer than any agile methods. So in the last few minutes of my talk, I want to very quickly show you a few patterns. And again, I apologize, I'm going to run out of time before I show all of these patterns to you, but I will show one or maybe two patterns of the organizational patterns. And skip this, skip that one. Let's start with developer controls process. Now the pattern, I'm only showing you the problem and the solution here. A successful organization is it's an organism. It works like that. But you have to have these points where everybody focuses and everybody coordinates together. And if you don't do that, things won't come together, so you have to do that. But what you want to do is make the developers the focal point of the process. In other words, the developers are the one who choose the process that they are going to follow. It makes sense, hopefully, to you, and it should feel good to all of you who are developers. You like to control that. The pattern gives you some of the why behind it. Another pattern, one of our favorites, is called moderate truck number. The truck number is, if you have an organization, imagine a software development organization, the truck number is the number of people in that organization where if any one of them were to get hit by a truck, your organization would be in trouble. You couldn't get the software out. So obviously you don't want the truck number to be equal to the number of developers you have, because if any one of them leaves and goes to a competitor, you are in trouble. So, but you don't want it to be zero either, because then you have so much overlap that it becomes inefficient. So we have a moderate number. That's the moderate truck number. How does agility handle that? Pair programming is one good way, and we see that supported in many agile methods. Ademar mentioned that we are writing patterns of Scrum, and we are working on that. If you go to this particular website, scrumplop.org, you can see the patterns. They are a work in progress. Many of them they're to a point that we feel like we've called them published. Again, they're not finished yet. And so I'll show you one or two of those. I think I will skip this one. Let me mention sprint goal for one quick reason. We've written this up as a pattern, and if you go to the Scrum guide, it kind of says, have a Scrum goal, and well, what's a Scrum goal? And there's been a lot of confusion about that. So we spent some time working on this and working on what it goes into it. There is the problem and the solution, but here's the whole pattern. There's the problem, there's the solution that you saw on the other page. Here's a lot of the why. These are the forces that explain the depth of the problem. And there's the other half of it. Okay. There will be a test on this, by the way. No, I wanted to show you this because it's much, much more than the problem and the solution. It's all this other insight, and that's why the patterns are so important. One more quick pattern. This one is something that Jeff Sutherland has realized, that you may not know what to improve as you're trying to improve your process. And so Jeff suggests ask your team what are the things that would increase their happiness the most. And as you improve those will turn out to be the things that give you the greatest productivity improvement. Why? Because people generally want to do the right thing, and they get intrinsic rewards by doing the right thing. And so if you ask them what will make them happy, you'll get to those things that will make them more effective. So that pattern is kind of a surprising one. Here's where we are. We've got about 133 patterns. Some may go away. We've got a draft book for those of us who are working on it, so it's internal consumption only. And it's about 400 pages long. That shows you where we are. We don't have a publication date yet, sorry. But if you go to that website, you can see this work as it's unfolding. Thank you. We've got a